Hello everybody, I'm Isabelle Fayolle and I'm a journalist. We're here in Paris at Leonard at Building Beyond. Welcome in this first episode. Today, let's talk about the World Energy Outlook. So with us to discuss today, Anthony Vautrin. Welcome. So to start, what is the role of the International Energy Agency?
So the IEA was created about 50 years ago, just after the first oil shock. So the plan was actually to coordinate the response to the crisis through oil reserves. And it's still the case today. So it's very much at the center of energy security. And the recent events have shown that the IEA helped in releasing 400 million of barrels of oil products in order to support the markets. Since 1974, the world has changed, and so did the IEA. So we still work very much on security, but also on sustainability and affordability. And one of the main analytical outputs that we deliver is the World Energy Outlook. So it's the team I work for that covers all fuels, all technologies, and which aims at analyzing the recent trends and the ongoing developments to 2035 or 2050.
So we are very pleased to invite you to summarize the World Energy Outlook for us. So globally, all over the world, the energy need increase. In this context, who are the new players?
So it's a key finding from the last World Energy Outlook, which is that we see energy demand increase as in the past, in the future. So the players are actually a bit different. If we start by looking back at the last decade, China was the single most important player. It drove half of the oil and gas demand growth in that period and about 60% of electricity demand growth. So really a major global player. And what we see for the decade to come is actually a shift in the center of gravity of demand growth from China to Southeast Asia and India. And those regions, joined by countries in the Middle East, Latin America, etc., they deliver most of the demand growth in the decade to come.
So do you have an example about that, about China?
Sure. So for instance, even on a longer period, what we see is actually very specific for the expansion of the global car fleet. Between 2000 and 2010, half of the growth in the car fleet was from advanced economies. From 2010 to today, roughly half of the growth in the car fleet, China. But in the near future, by 2035, half of the growth of that same car fleet will actually be from emerging markets and developing economies outside China. So it's reflecting the center of gravity which is moving around the world. Yeah, so we said that demand growth is said to happen in India, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Middle East, etc. But one interesting fact here is that actually demand grows in countries that have the best solar potential in the world. It's really massive. If we compare the past, most of the demand growth was coming from countries with medium or average solar conditions. But in the future, it's 80% of demand growth in countries with great solar conditions. It has huge implications. One of them is for cooling, of course, and the other one would be, for instance, for the potential for solar PV deployment.
You talk about the age of electricity after the age of gas. Why is electricity becoming so central to our economies?
Which is that maybe starting 10 years ago, we said gas is set to increase in the near future, and it did. So it did increase. So that was what we call the age of gas. And when looking at the data, we saw that there is a shift in momentum to electricity. And that's something we can easily understand. One of the reasons behind is that even if electricity has a small share in total consumption, 20% something, it's actually much more important in the economy as a whole because hospitals depend on electricity, the whole financial sector of the world depends on electricity, so about 40% of the economy depends on that single fuel. And indeed, it's accelerating faster than the total energy picture. And by 2035, electricity demand is set to increase by 10,000 terawatt-hour. So it's a huge number, difficult to understand. We can compare it with today the electricity consumption of the US, Canada, the European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, all that together. So it's a massive increase. And that increase is said to happen in China, that keeps electrifying, in other emerging market and developing economies, we discussed cooling, for instance, but also in advanced economies that recover with growth, even if it's stagnated for the last decade.
So what type of uses will develop in the next 10 years?
And it's actually new uses of electricity that are being developed compared to the last decade. So let's start with one of them, which is cooling and appliances in emerging market and developing economies. For instance, 80% of the world has some cooling needs at some point in the year, but only 40% of households have an AC. And that's a witness of the demand growth for cooling. And there are new uses that develop on top of that. And for instance, data centers that we can discuss, but also electric vehicles or heat pumps for the electrification of heat, or even the electrification of water desalination in the Middle East, which is a hot topic today.
About data centers, can you explain in simple terms why their electricity needs are growing so fast?
Yeah, so it's a very important question for which the world doesn't have that much data. So it's hard to know. So the momentum is that there is the rise of artificial intelligence since 2022, for instance. There is also the overall digitalization of the economy. If we try to take one data point to explain the growth in that sector, it's actually that some people say data is the new oil. But it's quite true in the sense that investments in data centers last year were higher than investments in oil supply in the same year. So at the IEA, one exercise that we try to do is actually to better understand where we stand today and where the world might evolve for data centers by 2035. It's a complex one. There is limited transparency in the world today. We made a report last year on energy and AI to improve the communication also between the big IT industry and the energy system. What we see is that today, data centers consume about 500 terawatt-hours of electricity each year. That quantity is relatively modest. It's equivalent to 1.5 percentage points of the global electricity demand consumed each year. And we see that demand grow in the near future. It could double to 2030 and potentially almost triple to 2035. So significant growth.
So about the data centers, where to build them? Do they increase the price of electricity? What are the steps involved in setting up a data center?
Indeed, so once we said that it's 1.5% of electricity demand and that it's set to double, triple, then what does it mean? One of the key insights that we might get is that then that quantity, that growth is quite limited. For instance, it would add less electricity demand than what ACs would add by 2035. But the data centers are heavily concentrated in some economies, and 85% of the data centers installed would be in the US, in the EU, or in China. And that has implications for electricity demand growth. So over the world, 10% of demand growth, modest, lower than ACs. But in advanced economies as a whole, 25%, a bigger share already. And in the US, half of electricity demand growth would come only from data centers. And it's even more complicated when we look at a more granular picture, because one key specificity with data centers is that they are heavily concentrated. They tend to cluster together, and they tend even to cluster close to cities, so already centers of consumption. That has implications for the robustness of electricity grids, for instance. And if the countries do not reinforce their electricity grids, we estimate that there are about 20% of data centers that are at risk of delays. If the grids are not reinforced either, it means that potentially, locally, especially in some markets, electricity prices might increase close to data centers.
Renewable energy is expanding rapidly. What are the main reasons behind this acceleration?
Renewable capacity additions are actually setting records for the 23rd year in a row. And that's led mostly by solar PV and somehow what we could describe as a virtuous cycle between the cost reduction of the technology and the policy support. And indeed, solar PV has support in more than 140 countries. And when we look ahead to 2035, the momentum continues. We see solar PV, but other forms of renewables and also low emission sources of electricity, such as nuclear, grow. One interesting comparison point is actually with the pledge that countries took in Dubai during COP28. And that pledge said that by 2030, the world would triple renewable capacity. And based on today's policy settings, we are not so far from there. We are seeing an increase by 2.6 times of renewable capacity. That evolution is significantly changing the picture of electricity systems. So it drives additional questions, notably how to ensure electricity security, considering the variable patterns, for instance, of solar PV or other renewables.
So about energy security, how changing power systems are reshaping electricity security.
So the power systems are under change. One of them, we just discussed, the rise of solar PV, but also wind, etc., means that generation has a variable pattern. The other one is also on the demand side. We are adding more air conditioners, the electrification of heat, but also electric vehicles, which makes demand patterns more variable. And when we take that picture as a whole, it means there are more challenges in ensuring that electricity systems are secure. We could name only two. One of them relates to what we would understand as peak demand. If we add more electric vehicles, more ACs, more heat pumps, then peak electricity demand might increase significantly. And we need to have the capacity to generate electricity at the same time. And the other key challenge would be to ensure that hour by hour, electricity supply can follow the patterns of the changing patterns of variable renewables or of variable demand. Those would be flexibility needs. And what we see is that by 2035, peak electricity demand is set to increase by 1,800 gigawatts. As an order of magnitude, peak demand of France, 100 gigawatts, so much bigger. And flexibility needs, it's even worse. It's even more complicated. They are set to quadruple. So it calls for additional investments into the power system. First in dispatchable capacity, as we did in the past, but also in storage and new forms of storage, for instance, with the deployment of batteries. We can also invest in new forms of flexibility, for instance, demand flexibility, consuming electricity when it's the cheapest, for instance. And eventually, there is the backbone of the electricity system, and we need to invest in grids, in electricity grids that heavily suffered underinvestment recently.
About energy access, so many people in the world still lack access to electricity or just clean cooking. Why is this issue so difficult to solve?
So we discussed today rising energy demand, rising electricity demand, but we need to keep in mind that there are about 2 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking solutions. And there are about 750 million, approximately, people who don't have access to electricity. And the trends are not great. Recently, electricity access stagnated. And even if clean cooking access improved recently, it was not the case in sub-Saharan Africa, where the higher rate was not enough to offset the growth in population. If we keep the same trend, we'll have still about the same number of people without access at the end of the decade. We did an analysis which was to compare the policies that worked the best in countries that managed to improve the access rate and to replicate to the countries that currently struggle. And we see that we could reach full electricity access by 2035 and full clean cooking access by 2040. And those solutions exist. LPG for clean cooking, but also natural gas electricity. And for electricity, solar home system, mini grids, just connection to the regular grids. There is a need for investments, but those investments are quite modest in size. For electricity, the world needs about $23 billion each year to reach full access by 2035. And for clean cooking, it only needs $4 billion each year to reach full access. And in order to communicate on that issue and to stimulate investment, the IEA is convening a summit on clean cooking this summer.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for coming to explain us the last World Energy Outlook and to summarize it for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.